This is Chapter 3, Module 2, the cell membrane. The learning objective of this chapter is to describe the structure and the components of the cell membrane. The cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. It provides a barrier from the extracellular fluid and thus physically isolates it from things outside the cell. The plasma membrane regulates what things can get in and out of the cell. Things like ions and nutrients will enter the cell, and things like waste products will be eliminated from the cell. The cell membrane will also allow some of the products that are produced in the cell to be released out of the cell and into the extracellular fluid. The plasma membrane is sensitive to the extracellular environment. It monitors the composition of the extracellular fluid and will also receive signals from chemicals within the extracellular fluid. The plasma membrane also anchors the cells to surrounding tissues. The plasma membrane contains lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. The majority of the plasma membrane are the lipids, or more specifically, phospholipids. The phospholipid is a lipid that has a head made of glycerol and a phosphate group, and two tails. The head is hydrophilic and will be attracted to water. The tails are hydrophobic and will repel away from water. The plasma membrane is made up of two layers of phospholipids called a phospholipid bilayer. These layers are arranged so that the tails of the phospholipids are oriented toward each other and the heads are oriented away. In one layer, the heads are touching the extracellular fluid, and in the other layer, the heads are touching the intracellular fluid. In this way, the tails don't have to touch the fluid on either side of the cell. This phospholipid bilayer makes an ideal barrier to ions and water, and the cell can control the entrance or exit of these substances. Between the tails of the phospholipids will be scattered cholesterol molecules. The cholesterol plays a part in making sure the tails don't stick together, which would hinder the function of the plasma membrane and cause it to be less fluid in its movement. The phospholipid bilayer allows the plasma membrane to have a fluidy type movement, and the other structures embedded in the plasma membrane can float around in between the phospholipids. We call this the fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane. Proteins are embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. These proteins can either be integral proteins or peripheral proteins. The integral proteins extend all the way through the phospholipid bilayer so that one end touches the extracellular fluid and the other end touches the intracellular fluid. The peripheral proteins, in contrast, are bound to either the inner or the outer surface of the membrane, but do not extend through the membrane. Proteins have several different roles for the cell. Some proteins are anchoring proteins. They merely attach the cell to either the outside structures, like another cell, or they attach themselves to structures inside the cell, like the cytoskeleton. Either way, they are anchoring the cell to something. Proteins can also be recognition proteins, where they protrude from the cell and act as ID tags for the cell's immune system, identifying the cell as a normal body cell, so the immune system doesn't destroy it. Proteins can also be enzymes. These proteins extend from the cell, and when they are activated, they will catalyze reactions either inside the cell or outside the cell. Some proteins are receptor proteins. These proteins bind to ions and hormones outside the cell. These ions and hormones are called ligands. The receptor proteins will catch these ligands and bring them into the cell. There are two major classes of proteins that help to transport substances across the cell membrane. These are the carrier proteins and the channel proteins. Carrier proteins are involved in assisting the transport of substances across the plasma membrane in a process called carrier-mediated transport, which we will discuss later in this module. Each carrier protein is designed to recognize only one substance or a group of similar substances. Channel proteins are proteins with hollow centers that allow the passageway of water and solutes through the membrane. There are many different types of protein channels that allow specific types of molecules to pass through. Protein channels with small diameters will only be able to allow small ions to pass through. Protein channels with larger diameters are able to allow substances like water and glucose to pass through. The plasma membrane also contains carbohydrates. These carbohydrates are usually attached to the phospholipid molecules or to the protein molecules of the plasma membrane. Their name is determined by what they are attached to. The proteoglycans and glycoproteins are attached to the proteins of the plasma membrane, and the glycolipids are attached to the phospholipid molecules. Proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and glycolipids all extend outside the plasma membrane and form a sticky sugar coat around the cell called the glycocalyx, similar to the slime on the outside of a fish. The glycocalyx lubricates the cell, protects it from dangerous foreign substances like viruses, and anchors the cell to extracellular objects. The glycocalyx carbohydrates act as receptors and will bind to pathogens such as bacteria and alert the cell of this new danger and aid in bringing them into the cell where they can be destroyed by enzymes. Some of these carbohydrates will recognize foreign objects and alert the immune system that it may be under attack.
Between the living machinery of the inner cell and the harsh conditions of the outside world stands the cell's plasma membrane. As crucial as this barrier is, it's surprisingly flexible. Push it and watch it move. Poke hard enough and it might break and begin to regroup. The lipid molecules of the membrane naturally assemble in a double layer because their tails repel water as their heads attract it. Throw in some cholesterol and a few carbohydrates, and you have the basic structure of a plasma membrane. Within these lipid molecules, we also find different proteins which do various things for the cell. For instance, they receive signals from the world outside, or they transport nutrients and waste. So nature composes the membrane with a combination or mosaic of different lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. And these molecules are not stationary. They constantly move within the structure, fluidly changing their positions. The survival of all life rests on this veil of material. A supple membrane, just 2 molecules thick.
This ends Module 2 of Chapter 3, the cell membrane.